At 27, Grover Cleveland bought a baby carriage for a newborn girl. 21 years later, the 49-year-old president married the infant who slept in it. This wasn't a White House fairy tale. It was a 2-decade psychological grooming operation, a calculated plan to raise a wife, and the darkest marriage American history actively tried to sanitize. Buffalo, New York, in the 1860s operates as a boom town of iron, grain, and sudden fortunes. Stephen Grover Cleveland does not fit the mold. Born in 1837 in the quiet town of Caldwell, New Jersey, he relocated to Buffalo to build his career. Here, he operates as a plodding, humorless workhorse in the local legal circuit. His defining psychological flaw is a suffocating inflexibility. He cannot delegate. He cannot compromise. He must control the board. During his tenure as sheriff of Erie County, a grim detail perfectly captures his nature. He refuses to hire a hangman. Instead, he personally springs the trapdoor at 2 separate executions because he does not trust a subordinate to handle the mechanics of death. That habit of demanding absolute physical control over outcomes will later dictate the entire existence of Francis Folsom. His law partner, Oscar Folsom, represents everything Cleveland is not. Oscar is electric, heavily indebted, and dangerously charismatic. He thrives on chaos while Cleveland thrives on ledgers. They form a symbiotic relationship. Oscar charms the clients, and Cleveland executes the grinding paperwork. When Francis Folsom is born in Buffalo in the summer of 1864, the 27-year-old Cleveland immediately embeds himself into the family structure. He adopts the moniker Uncle Cleve. The visual contrast is stark. A rapidly expanding, heavy-jowled man bringing expensive toys to a fragile infant. Before the child can even speak, he establishes a pattern of transactional affection, cementing himself as the primary source of luxury and stability in the girl's life. For a decade, this dynamic festers in the background. Cleveland grinds his way up the political and legal ladder, gaining physical mass and local authority. He remains stubbornly unmarried, rejecting the societal expectation to take a wife of his own age. Oscar continues his reckless spending, leaning increasingly on his partner's grim, unshakable stability. The Folsom household operates on a knife's edge of debt, stabilized only by Cleveland's proximity and deep pockets. Up to this point, the arrangement remains legally and socially unremarkable. He is just the generous godfather figure. The trap is meticulously set, but the door remains open. Francis is still a child with a living father. Then, on the afternoon of July 23rd, 1875, that door slams shut forever. Oscar Folsom, driving his carriage through the streets of Buffalo with his characteristic reckless velocity, loses control and overturns. He is thrown to the pavement and killed instantly. Francis is 11 years old. The immediate aftermath is not merely a tragedy of sudden death. It is a financial and social catastrophe. Oscar Folsom lived large, drank heavily, and died entirely in debt. Crucially, he died intestate. He left no will. In the legal framework of 1870s New York, a widow whose husband died intestate found herself thrust into a bureaucratic nightmare, her financial agency severely restricted, and her assets immediately targeted by aggressive creditors. Emma Folsom is left terrified, grieving, and completely exposed. The ground gives way beneath them. The chaos requires an anchor. Grover Cleveland steps into the vacuum. He does not hesitate. He moves with the heavy, unstoppable momentum of a freight train. He immediately petitions the surrogate court and is legally appointed the administrator of Oscar Folsom's chaotic estate. The public views this as the ultimate act of fraternal loyalty. the unsmiling, steadfast lawyer stepping up to catch the falling family of his brilliant, flawed best friend. The optics are perfect for his burgeoning political career. The reality of the execution is far more clinical and deeply revealing of his psychological framework. Cleveland avoids the messy reality of legal adoption. Keeping the widow and child out of his own home spares him the daily friction and shared emotional authority of domestic life. Driven by an obsessive, suffocating need for total dominance over his environment, he prefers a cleaner, more absolute mechanism of control. He establishes a dictatorship of the ledger. He takes absolute command of their survival from a geographical distance. He sorts through Oscar's tangled debts with ruthless efficiency. When the estate's funds predictably fall short, Cleveland quietly begins injecting his own considerable capital. He pays the rent on their dwelling. He buys the groceries. He funds the winter coats. He effectively places the mother and daughter on a strict invisible allowance, entirely dependent on his ongoing goodwill. He creates an impenetrable perimeter of financial security around them, but he holds the only key to the gate. The psychological architecture of this arrangement immediately and permanently warps the power dynamic for an 11-year-old girl. Frances is entering adolescence, a period biologically and socially defined by the search for independence. Instead, every physical aspect of her existence is underwritten by a 38-year-old man who views the world strictly in terms of ledgers, debts, and absolute compliance. She is acutely aware that her mother's fragile peace of mind, her own education, and the very roof over their heads depend entirely on Uncle Cleve. He is no longer just the heavy-set man who bought the wicker carriage. He is the bank. He is the law. He is the sole architect of her reality. This is the most insidious form of grooming. It does not require coercion, physical force, or overt threats. It relies on the crushing silent weight of absolute gratitude. How do you rebel against the man who saved your mother from the poorhouse? How do you form an independent identity when your entire physical survival is an ongoing gift from a man who expects nothing less than total deference? You do not. You comply. You adapt your shape to fit the contours of the cage. And here is where the story reveals a staggering contradiction. As Francis grows, so does Cleveland's ambition and his physical mass. He becomes a massive, immovable object in Buffalo politics. In 1881, he runs for mayor, campaigning on a platform of brutal efficiency and anti-corruption. He earns the nickname Grover the Good and the Veto Mayor. He vetoes spending bills with a ruthless, almost gleeful pleasure, refusing to let corrupt city aldermen spend a single unauthorized cent. He builds a national brand based on inflexible integrity and a refusal to compromise. Yet, observe the glaring gap between his public rigidity and his private cultivation. In the mayor's office, he is an island, refusing counsel, operating late into the night alone with his paperwork, fighting the monopolistic political machines. But regarding the Folsom women, he is operating his own private monopoly. He is heavily involved in every micro decision of their lives. He directs Emma on where they should live. He dictates the parameters of Francis's social circle. He manages a rapidly growing industrial city by day and manages a teenage girl's future by night. He requires absolute submission from his political opponents and absolute reliance from his ward. The mechanism of power is identical. Only the target changes. This dynamic hardens into concrete over the next several years. Frances transitions from a grieving child into a striking, highly intelligent young woman. The age gap of 27 years remains static, But the nature of the gap evolves. He is no longer dealing with a child in mourning. He is financing a young woman on the verge of entering the marriage market. He immediately moves to assert control over her intellectual and geographical environment. He does not just pay for her higher education, he selects the institution. He chooses Wells College in Aurora, New York. This is a crucial strategic decision. Wells College is an elite institution, but it is deeply isolated. It is nestled in a small village on the shores of Cayuga Lake, far removed from the bustling social markets of New York City, Boston, or even Buffalo. He is paying for a premium education, but more importantly, he is paying for geography. He is keeping her removed from the natural ecosystem of young men, her own age. He is isolating the asset. During her time at Wells, the psychological tether is never allowed to slacken. He writes to her constantly. He requires her to write back. He sends a steady stream of flowers, expensive gifts, and explicit instructions regarding her conduct. He maintains a continuous, unbreakable presence in her daily life, even from hundreds of miles away. The public sees a generous godfather funding a bright girl's education, a testament to his noble character. The ledger shows a man patiently paying the premiums on a long-term investment, ensuring that when the policy matures, there will be absolutely no other competitors for the payout. The mother, Emma Folsom, is completely complicit in this arrangement. We must look at her not with judgment, but through the harsh economic reality of a Victorian widow. Emma is trapped. She has no independent income. Her social standing is entirely tethered to Cleveland's patronage. She actively facilitates his access to her daughter because her own survival depends on it. She becomes the warden of Cleveland's holding pen. She ensures Frances writes her letters. She enforces the boundaries Cleveland sets. Emma trades her daughter's future autonomy for present financial security, a tragic but entirely common transaction in an era where women were legally and economically marginalized. Cleveland knows this. He relies on Emma's fear of poverty to enforce his will locally while he builds his empire in Albany. Up to this point, the entire operation is completely legal, entirely normalized by the standards of the day, and universally praised by Victorian society. He is the savior. She is the grateful beneficiary. But the plot twist arrives in 1882. Grover Cleveland's meteoric political rise accelerates beyond anyone's calculation. He bypasses local politics entirely and is elected governor of New York. Suddenly, the plodding lawyer from Buffalo is thrust onto the national stage. The media spotlight intensifies. The political machine gears up for a presidential run, and the carefully constructed silent wall between his private obsession with Frances Folsom and his public ambition is about to face an explosive collision. And this very habit of demanding absolute, unquestioned control in the shadows will shortly be dragged into the brutal, unforgiving light of the dirtiest presidential campaign in American history. The political ascent of Grover Cleveland defies normal chronological logic. In 1881, he is a local Buffalo lawyer. By 1882, he is the mayor. By 1883, he is the governor of New York. By 1884, he is the Democratic nominee for the presidency of the United States. He goes from a municipal desk to the threshold of the White House in 36 months. He achieves this not through soaring rhetoric or magnetic charisma, but through the weaponization of his own psychological flaw, his absolute suffocating rigidity. He becomes the anti-politician in an era choked by political machines. He publicly goes to war with Tammany Hall, the corrupt Democratic organization running New York City, openly defying its boss, John Kelly. The public watches this massive, unsmiling man veto bill after bill, crushing patronage networks and refusing to negotiate. They label him Grover the Good. They perceive his obsessive need for total control as a righteous crusade for civic honesty. The American electorate buys into the brand of the immovable object. But the brand is a carefully maintained fortress, and in the summer of 1884, the opposition finds the hidden door. On July 21st, 1884, the Buffalo Evening Telegraph detonates a political explosive that threatens to vaporize Cleveland's entire moral architecture. The headline introduces the nation to Maria Halpine. 10 years prior, Cleveland, then a bachelor lawyer, had an intimate relationship with Halpine, a widow working in Buffalo. She became pregnant. When the child, named Oscar Folsom Cleveland, was born, the situation required management. The issue is not the affair itself. Sexual indiscretions were common among Gilded Age power brokers. The issue, the defining metric of Cleveland's character, is how he executed the cover-up. He did not simply write a check and walk away. He utilized the full, terrifying weight of his legal and institutional connections to obliterate a human liability. When Halpin allegedly began drinking and threatening his public standing, Cleveland did not negotiate. He arranged for the child to be forcibly removed and placed in the Protestant orphan asylum. He then orchestrated the involuntary commitment of Maria Halpin to the Providence Lunatic Asylum. Look closely at the mechanics of this retaliation. He did not just silence a woman. He used the state apparatus to erase her sanity and steal her child. It was a demonstration of absolute, unchecked dominance. When the director of the Providence Asylum examined Halpin, he quickly realized she was not legally insane and released her days later. But the damage was permanently inflicted. Her child was gone, eventually adopted by a wealthy family in western New York. Halpin was socially ruined, paid off with $500, and exiled. When the Republican press unearths this in 1884, they print vicious cartoons. They chant, "Ma, Ma, where's my pa? Gone to the White House? Ha, ha, ha." Cleveland's political managers panic. They advise him to deny everything, to launch a counter-smear campaign. Cleveland refuses. He issues a famous telegram to his operatives. "Whatever you do, tell the truth." The public praises this as the ultimate act of political courage. They forgive him. They view his admission as proof of his legendary honesty. They are looking at the wrong variable. The admission of the affair was a calculated political triage. The true horror, the use of an insane asylum to dispose of an inconvenient woman, was neatly glossed over by a sympathetic press. The public forgave him because they judged him on his everyday persona of honesty, entirely missing the second column of our rubric, how he exercised power when threatened. He proved he possessed the capacity for total clinical destruction of anyone who jeopardized his carefully ordered universe. And here is where the historical narrative becomes profoundly disturbing. You must place two images side by side to grasp the sheer psychological dissonance of Grover Cleveland in 1884. On one side of the split screen, you have a political titan battling through the filthiest election in American history, his past exposed, his ruthless treatment of Maria Halpin splashed across broadsheets from Boston to San Francisco. He is wrestling in the mud of the national arena. On the other side of the screen, shielded behind the stone walls of Wells College in the quiet, frozen isolation of Aurora, New York, sits Frances Folsom. She is 20 years old. She is entirely insulated from the Maria Halpin scandal. Cleveland ensures it. He is simultaneously destroying one woman's reputation in the press while meticulously preserving the pristine environment of another. While the nation screams about his illegitimate child, Cleveland is calmly writing letters to Frances, advising her on her coursework. He pays the tuition that keeps her housed in that elite dormitory. He funds the fresh flowers delivered to her desk. He dictates the boundaries of her intellectual consumption. He acts as the sole, unyielding filter between this young woman and the chaotic reality of the outside world. He is cultivating a perfect, untouched asset, while his own hands are covered in political blood. The contrast is staggering. It highlights the dual nature of his control. He uses institutional force to break Maria Halpin, and he uses overwhelming financial benevolence to bind Frances Folsom. The tools are different, but the objective remains identical: absolute ownership of the women in his orbit. During her years at Wells College, the psychological tether hardens into steel. Frances is bright, capable, and highly social, yet her entire future is already mortgaged. She writes to Cleveland regularly. The correspondence is entirely unbalanced. She is a college student reporting her grades. He is the governor of New York, and soon the president-elect dictating her reality. He does not treat her as an equal partner in a burgeoning romance. He treats her as a proprietary project. He advises her on which subjects to study, subtly steering her away from anything that might breed ideological independence. He is shaping her intellect to be entirely complementary to his own. He is not preparing her for the world. He is preparing her for him. The financial dependency that began when she was 11 has evolved into a deep internalized psychological reliance. When she looks at her future, she does not see a landscape of infinite choices. She sees the heavy, immovable silhouette of Uncle Cleve standing at the end of every possible path. In November 1884, the election results are finalized. Cleveland wins the presidency by a razor-thin margin, carrying his home state of New York by just over 1,000 votes. He achieves the ultimate political prize. He is moving to Washington. He will occupy the executive mansion as a bachelor. The media apparatus immediately pivots from the scandals of his past to the vacancy in his future. The White House requires a first lady. The social obligations of the presidency demand a hostess. The press begins to aggressively speculate, drawing up lists of eligible widows and wealthy heiresses who might secure the arm of the most powerful man in the country. Cleveland watches the media frenzy build. He knows exactly what he possesses, and he knows exactly when the investment will mature. Frances is scheduled to graduate from Wells College in the summer of 1885. The timing is mathematically perfect. He has secured the highest office in the land, and the asset he has been cultivating for a decade is finally coming of age. The cage is fully constructed, the door is wide open, and the political machine of the United States is about to provide the ultimate cover story for a transaction that began 21 years ago in a Buffalo baby carriage. The trap is set for the final brutal pivot. The inauguration of Grover Cleveland in March 1885 fundamentally alters the playing field. He is no longer just the governor of New York or the guardian of a deceased friend's estate. He is the president of the United States. He occupies the executive mansion as a bachelor, the first man to do so since James Buchanan nearly 30 years prior. The physical reality of the Gilded Age presidency is brutal. Cleveland works obsessively, often until 2 or 3 in the morning, personally answering letters and reviewing minor administrative appointments because his hamartia, that crippling pathological need to control every microscopic detail prevents him from delegating even the most trivial tasks. He is a massive, sweating, irritable man trapped in a house that is equal parts office and public museum. He despises the social requirements of the office. He loathes the endless receptions, the state dinners, the necessity of small talk. His sister, Rose Elizabeth Cleveland, a fiercely intellectual and independent woman, steps in as a temporary White House hostess. But she detests the superficiality of Washington society as much as he does. The administration has a structural deficit. The American public, fueled by a rapidly expanding and aggressive newspaper industry, demands a first lady. They want glamour. They want a royal court. They want a romance. Cleveland knows this. He understands the political utility of a wife, but he is not going to enter the Washington marriage market. He does not need to. He already owns the asset. He has been funding it, shaping it, and waiting for it to mature for exactly 21 years. Frances Folsom is 20 years old, finishing her senior year at Wells College. The timeline is mathematically perfect. But here is where things really get dirty. Cleveland faces a tactical problem. If he announces his intention to marry a college student 28 years his junior, a girl he has financially managed since she was 11, the press will crucify him. The narrative of Grover the Good will be shattered by the optics of a predatory guardianship. The public would immediately recognize the massive, terrifying power imbalance. So Cleveland executes one of the most brilliant and cynical media misdirections in the history of the American presidency. He builds a smokescreen out of the mother. In the spring of 1885, Emma Folsom and her daughter Frances visit the White House. The Washington press corps, desperate for any hint of a presidential romance, immediately swarms the story. They observe the president's deep, long-standing connection to the Folsom family. They see him spending time with the widow of his late best friend. The newspapers leap to the most socially acceptable conclusion. They begin printing widespread, confident rumors that Grover Cleveland is courting Emma Folsom. She is age-appropriate. She is dignified. It fits the Victorian narrative of a noble man honoring his dead friend by marrying his widow. Observe Cleveland's reaction to this national rumor. He does absolutely nothing. He issues no denials. He sends no telegrams correcting the record. He sits in the Oval Office puffing on his cigars and allows the entire American media apparatus to construct a false reality. This is not a passive act. It is an active, aggressive use of silence. As a seasoned trial lawyer, Cleveland knows that letting a witness believe a lie is often more effective than telling one. By allowing the press to chase the mother, he completely shields the daughter. He buys himself time. He keeps the spotlight exactly where he wants it, away from his actual target. The issue isn't just that he deceived the public. The issue is how effortlessly he manipulated the national conversation to protect a private acquisition. While the press is writing editorials about Emma Folsom, Cleveland is making his final decisive move on Frances. In June 1885, Frances graduates from Wells College. She is 21 years old. She is now legally an adult. This is the moment of maximum vulnerability for Cleveland's 21-year investment. If Frances enters the social season in New York or Washington, she will immediately become the most sought-after young woman in the country. She is beautiful, highly educated, and possesses an undeniable magnetic charm. She will meet young, wealthy men of her own generation. She will be exposed to a market where Grover Cleveland is no longer the only buyer. Cleveland cannot allow this. His need for absolute control cannot tolerate competition. He must remove her from the board entirely before the game even begins. So, As a graduation present, Uncle Cleve purchases a grand tour of Europe for Frances and her mother. He books them a passage on a transatlantic steamer. He pays for the itinerary. He funds the entire expedition. The public views this as the ultimate act of generosity from a wealthy godfather. The reality is far more clinical. This is an exile. It is a golden cage shipped across an ocean. He is deliberately isolating the asset. He is ensuring that the critical transition period between her college graduation and her marriage is spent entirely dependent on his financial stipends, communicating only through his letters completely removed from the American marriage market. He sends her thousands of miles away to ensure she remains exactly where he put her. The physical distance between Washington and Paris is vast, but the psychological tether remains incredibly tight. It is during this European exile, in the late summer of 1885, that the final transaction occurs. He bypasses the traditional romance of crossing the ocean or dropping to one knee. Instead, he simply sends a letter proposing marriage via transatlantic mail. Consider the brutal reality of that Parisian hotel room when Frances Folsom opens that letter. What are her actual options? She is 21. She has never held a job. She has no independent wealth. Every dress she wears, every meal she eats, the very bed she is sitting on in Europe is paid for by the man asking for her hand, the man who is now the President of the United States. He is the singular architect of her reality, the man who saved her mother from ruin, the man who dictated her education. To reject Grover, Cleveland's proposal, would not just be declining a suitor. It would be an act of total financial and social suicide. It would mean severing the only lifeline she and her mother have known for a decade. It would require a level of rebellion that her entire upbringing, meticulously curated by Cleveland himself, was designed to eradicate. The psychological pressure is crushing, absolute, and entirely invisible. She is completely trapped by gratitude. She writes back, she accepts. The contract is finalized. The secret holds for nearly a year. Cleveland continues to govern. Frances continues to travel, quietly purchasing a wedding trousseau in the fashion houses of Paris, paid for by the groom. But a secret this massive cannot survive the Washington ecosystem forever. By the spring of 1886, the Emma Folsom smokescreen begins to clear. Rumors begin leaking from the diplomatic corps and the European suppliers. The press catches the scent, and when they finally realize who the actual bride is, the national reaction is explosive. The shock is palpable. The president is not marrying the widow. He is marrying the child. The 28-year age gap suddenly becomes the dominant conversation. The image of the massive 49-year-old politician and the delicate 21-year-old girl dominates the front pages. Cleveland's reaction to the media explosion perfectly illustrates his fatal weakness. He does not handle the scrutiny with grace. He reacts with violent territorial rage. His need for total dominance over his environment is suddenly challenged by the unstoppable force of the Gilded Age press. He refers to the reporters as ghouls and animals. He is furious that the public feels entitled to discuss his private property. He views their curiosity not as a natural byproduct of his office, but as a direct assault on his ownership. He tries to control the uncontrollable, ordering his staff to maintain absolute silence, refusing to confirm the date or the location of the wedding until the very last moment. He is treating the First Lady of the United States like a classified state secret. June 2nd, 1886, the White House, the climax of the long game. Cleveland has engineered something that has never happened before and will never happen again. A president marrying within the walls of the executive mansion. The physical environment of the wedding is a perfect visual metaphor for the relationship itself. It is suffocatingly controlled. The ceremony takes place in the Blue Room. It is June in Washington, D.C., and the heat is already oppressive. Cleveland, sweating profusely in a tight, custom-made tuxedo, has ordered the room completely saturated with flowers. Thousands of roses, orchids, and pansies are banked against the walls, wrapping around the columns, choking the fireplaces. The scent is overwhelming, almost narcotic. The gas lights are blazing, driving the temperature even higher. It is a closed, overheated, incredibly intense environment. There are no crowds. There is no public celebration. There are fewer than 40 guests, strictly limited to cabinet members and immediate family. The press is entirely locked out, barred from the grounds. Cleveland has successfully isolated her one final time. Frances Folsom enters the room. She is 21. She is wearing a dress of stiff, heavy ivory satin trimmed with orange blossoms. The visual contrast is jarring. She looks ethereal, youthful, almost fragile against the massive, dark, immovable bulk of Grover Cleveland. He is more than double her weight and more than double her age. The Marine Band plays Mendelssohn's Wedding March. They stand before the Reverend Byron Sunderland, and here, in the middle of the vows, Cleveland delivers his final masterstroke of psychological manipulation. He has personally rewritten the traditional wedding liturgy. When it comes time for Frances to speak her vows, the word obey has been conspicuously deleted. She promises to love, honor, and keep, but she does not promise to obey. When the press eventually learns of this detail, they herald it as a triumph of modern progressive thought. They paint Cleveland as an enlightened husband, a man who respects his young wife as an equal. It is the perfect public relations victory. But examine this through the lens of a prosecutor. Look at the ledger. When a man has spent 15 years actively molding a woman's mind, when he has controlled her education, curated her environment, isolated her from peers, managed her mother, and entirely monopolized her financial survival, he does not need her to utter the word obey in a 20-minute ceremony. The obedience is already permanently woven into the fabric of her existence. It is a foundational element of her existence. Removing the word obey from the vows is not an act of liberation. It is the ultimate flex of absolute power. It is a man who holds the deed to the property, magnanimously telling the tenant she doesn't need to say, "Thank you." He removes the word because the reality of the submission is already total, undeniable, and permanent. The trap doesn't need to snap shut. It was welded closed years ago. Grover Cleveland slides the ring onto Frances Folsom's finger. The 21-year investment has finally paid out. The carriage bought in Buffalo has arrived at the Blue Room. The morning of June 3, 1886, marks the immediate collision between Grover Cleveland's private obsession with total control and the uncontrollable machinery of the Gilded Age press. The wedding is over. The 21-year investment is secured. Cleveland now attempts to execute the next phase of his psychological architecture, total isolation of his new asset. He books a honeymoon at a private cottage in Deer Park, Maryland, high in the Catoctin Mountains. He expects absolute privacy. He expects the American media to respect the boundaries he has rigidly drawn around his personal life. This expectation perfectly illustrates his defining hamartia. He fundamentally misunderstands the nature of the transaction he just completed. By marrying a 21-year-old girl in the White House. He did not just acquire a wife, he created a national spectacle. The press does not respect his boundaries. They invade them with unprecedented aggression. When the presidential train departs Washington, it is pursued by a secondary train packed entirely with reporters, telegraph operators, and sketch artists. When the couple arrives at Deer Park, they find the perimeter of their private honeymoon cottage ringed by the media. Reporters establish a camp just outside the property line. They set up high-powered telescopes on the surrounding ridges, aiming them directly into the windows of the presidential suite. They log every time the couple opens a curtain, every time they sit on the porch, every time a meal is delivered. When Cleveland and Frances attempt to go for a carriage ride, journalists sprint alongside them, shouting questions, aggressively documenting the physical proximity of the heavy middle-aged man and his young bride. The reality of the honeymoon immediately shatters Cleveland's expectations. He intended to construct a fortified, isolated environment where he could finalize his psychological dominance in total secrecy. Instead, he finds himself trapped in a glass box, observed by millions. His reaction is violent, physical, and deeply revealing. He does not handle the intrusion with the political grace required of his office. He physically bristles. He writes furious, venomous letters to his political associates back in Washington, utilizing language that strips the reporters of their humanity. He explicitly calls them animals and ghouls. He states that they are behaving like beasts, trying to steal his property. He views the press not as a democratic institution, but as a direct physical threat to his ownership of Frances. He is raging against his sudden, terrifying loss of control. He spent a decade carefully managing every micro detail of this girl's existence, and within 24 hours of marrying her, he realizes he cannot control the men with the telescopes. But here is where the story shifts and the psychological dynamic begins. Its slow, fascinating inversion. Look at how Frances Folsom Cleveland reacts to the men with the telescopes. She is 21 years old. She has been cloistered in a remote women's college, funded by a man who demanded absolute submission, and she is now thrust into the most intense media spotlight on the planet. By all logical metrics, she should crack. She should hide behind her massive husband. She should become a reclusive, terrified victim of her circumstances. She does the exact opposite. While Cleveland stews in furious, impotent rage inside the carriage, Frances looks out the window at the sprinting reporters. She smiles. She waves. She acknowledges them. She does not display an ounce of fear or resentment. She instantly, intuitively understands something that her 49-year-old husband never will. You cannot defeat the press with rigidity, but you can conquer them with accessibility. She realizes that the public attention is not a threat to her survival. It is her primary weapon of independence. When they return to the White House, the Frankie phenomenon erupts. It is a cultural explosion that anticipates the celebrity worship of the 20th century. Frances Cleveland becomes the most famous, heavily documented woman in America. And she uses this fame to meticulously, quietly carve out her own territory within the cage Cleveland built for her. He dictates the politics of the nation, but she instantly commands the social and cultural architecture of the presidency. She begins hosting 2 receptions a week, including one on Saturday afternoon specifically designed so that working-class women, shop girls, factory workers, clerks can attend and shake her hand. Cleveland is horrified by this breach of executive distance, but he cannot stop her. Her popularity is an overwhelming political asset. The American public, previously divided by the vicious election of 1884 and the Maria Halpine scandal unites in their absolute adoration of the First Lady. Examine the physical manifestations of her growing power. Women across the country begin aggressively copying her aesthetic. When Frances adopts a hairstyle featuring a low-curled knot at the nape of her neck, millions of American women immediately replicate it. It becomes universally known as the Frances Cleveland. When she stops wearing the restrictive, heavily structured bustles typical of Victorian fashion, the entire garment industry shifts its production lines. She does not issue decrees, she simply exists, and the market bends to her image. This leads to a bizarre and highly revealing legal crisis that perfectly encapsulates Cleveland's desperate, failing attempts to maintain total ownership. Because Frances is so universally beloved, Gilded Age corporations realize her face is the ultimate marketing tool. Without seeking permission, companies begin slapping unauthorized portraits of the First Lady on everything. Her face appears on boxes of cheap cigars, on advertisements for arsenic complexion wafers, on liver pills, on sewing machines, on theatrical posters. She is commodified by the industrial machine. Cleveland's reaction is entirely predictable. His territorial instincts are triggered. He is infuriated that other men are utilizing his asset for their own financial gain. He views these advertisements as a theft of his personal property. He attempts to use the full weight of the federal government to stop it. He orders his political allies in Congress to draft a bill which becomes known as the Cleveland Bill, specifically designed to make it a federal crime to use the image of any living woman for commercial purposes without her written consent. The bill fails. It is deemed an unconstitutional overreach of federal power. The failure of this legislation is a critical marker in the story. It is the moment Grover Cleveland realizes that while he successfully cornered the market on Frances Folsom in private, he cannot control her public consumption. He owns the woman, but the nation owns the icon. Frances, meanwhile, navigates this bizarre landscape with terrifying efficiency. She does not act like a groomed victim. She acts like a highly sophisticated political operative. She understands the gap between how the public perceives her and her inner reality. The public sees a sweet, compliant, incredibly young bride. She uses that perception to ruthlessly manage her husband's image and political liabilities. Consider the incident with the Women's Christian Temperance Union, the WCTU. In the 1880s, the WCTU is one of the most powerful, aggressive political lobbying groups in the country. They demand the total prohibition of alcohol. Frances Cleveland, unlike previous First Ladies, explicitly refuses to ban wine from White House state dinners. She enjoys a glass of wine. The WCTU is furious. They launch a massive, coordinated smear campaign. They circulate a completely fabricated rumor, publishing pamphlets claiming that Frances has secretly signed their temperance pledge and is forcing the president to stop drinking. It is a direct attack on her autonomy, an attempt to hijack her popularity for their political agenda. How does the 22-year-old girl raised in a system of absolute male authority handle a national political attack? She doesn't ask her husband to issue a veto. She doesn't hide behind his massive silhouette. She directly and publicly annihilates the WCTU. She issues a highly publicized, brutally polite letter explicitly denying any affiliation with the temperance movement, stating clearly that she has made no such pledge and will not allow her name to be used for political coercion. She neutralizes one of the most feared lobbying groups in Washington with a single sheet of White House stationery. Cleveland watches this happen. He realizes that the girl he groomed to be a compliant, silent partner is actually a far more effective political communicator than he is. This dynamic reaches its breaking point during the election of 1888. Cleveland runs for a second term against the Republican nominee Benjamin Harrison. The campaign is brutal, focused heavily on tariffs and economic policy. Cleveland's obsession with rigid economic rules alienates key voting blocs. He loses the Electoral College. He is voted out of office. It is a massive, humiliating public rejection of Grover the Good. Look at the psychological roles during the transition. Cleveland is depressed, exhausted, and bitter. He retreats into his inflexible shell. He packs his ledgers. But Frances provides the midpoint peak of her own personal narrative. As she is directing the White House staff to pack their belongings, she speaks to Jerry Smith, an enslaved man who had worked at the White House since the Lincoln administration. She gives him a very specific, chillingly confident instruction. She says, "Now, Jerry, I want you to take good care of all the furniture and ornaments in the house, for I want to find everything just as it is now when we come back again." Smith asks when they will return. Frances replies, "We are coming back 4 years from today." This is not the statement of a passive ward following her guardian into exile. This is a political prophecy from a woman who has tasted ultimate power and has absolutely no intention of relinquishing it permanently. She does not view the 1888 loss as the end of her husband's career. She views it as a temporary interruption of her own reign. The interregnum years, from 1889 to 1893, are spent in New York City. Cleveland returns to corporate law. He makes a significant amount of money. He attempts to reconstruct the closed, isolated environment he had engineered before the presidency. But the power dynamic has fundamentally shifted. Frances is no longer the dependent college student entirely reliant on his financial grace. She is the former First Lady, a national celebrity, deeply connected to the power brokers of New York society. She expands her social circle. She engages in aggressive philanthropy. And, significantly, she begins to manage his political rehabilitation. When the 1892 election approaches, the Democratic Party is fractured. Many do not want to nominate Cleveland again. He is seen as too rigid, too unyielding, a relic of the past. It is Frances who serves as the ultimate bridge. The party bosses tolerate Cleveland's inflexibility because they desperately want Frances back on the campaign posters. She is the velvet glove over his iron fist. He wins the 1892 election, defeating Harrison and becoming the only president in American history to serve 2 non-consecutive terms. He achieves this historic victory largely because the American electorate wants Frances Folsom back in the Blue Room. They return to Washington in March 1893. Frances has fulfilled her prophecy, but the second term is not a triumphant continuation of the Gilded Age fairy tale. It is a descent into economic and physical nightmare, and it provides the ultimate grotesque contradiction of their entire relationship. Within weeks of his second inauguration, the panic of 1893 strikes. It is the worst economic depression the United States has ever faced up to that point. Banks collapse, railroads go bankrupt, unemployment skyrockets. The country is violently tearing itself apart through labor strikes and agrarian revolts. Cleveland's rigid economic philosophy, his absolute refusal to compromise on the gold standard, makes him deeply, intensely unpopular. He is suddenly the most hated man in America, and precisely at the moment his political empire is collapsing, his physical body betrays him. In June 1893, A rough, ulcerated lesion is discovered on the roof of Cleveland's mouth. The diagnosis is terrifying and definitive: a highly malignant, aggressive carcinoma. It is oral cancer. It is growing rapidly. If left untreated, it will kill him in months. We now enter a sequence of events that reads like a medical horror thriller, entirely driven by Cleveland's pathological need for total secrecy and control. He is facing an economic apocalypse. He knows that if the American public, already panicked by the bank failures, learns that the president is dying of cancer, the stock market will completely disintegrate. Total financial ruin will follow. He must have the tumor removed, but he absolutely refuses to go to a hospital. He refuses to allow the press to know. He demands that the surgery be executed with the same level of absolute, suffocating secrecy he used to hide his courtship of Frances. He coordinates a massive high-risk deception. He announces that he is going on a 4-day fishing trip off the coast of New York aboard the private yacht Oneida, owned by his wealthy friend Elias Benedict. On July 1st, 1893, the Oneida sails into the Long Island Sound. The yacht is moving, pitching in the waves. Below deck, in the yacht's small saloon, a team of 6 elite surgeons, led by Dr. Joseph Bryant, have transformed the space into a makeshift, deeply unsterile operating theater. They lash a wooden chair to the mast to keep it from sliding. They strap the massive 260-pound President of the United States into the chair. They administer nitrous oxide and ether. And then, as the yacht violently rocks, they begin to cut. Because Cleveland demands that there be no outward scarring on his face, no visible evidence that his physical architecture has been breached. The surgeons must operate entirely from the inside of his mouth. Using retractors and bone saws, they spend 90 agonizing minutes carving out his entire upper left jaw, portions of his hard palate, and several teeth. They extract a gelatinous, foul-smelling tumor the size of a golf ball. They pack the massive, gaping cavity in his skull with gauze. They inject him with morphine. It is a grotesque, desperate act of survival. And it forces a complete, total inversion of the 21-year power dynamic. When Cleveland wakes up, he is a physically broken man. His speech is entirely unintelligible. The removal of his jaw means his voice merely echoes wetly in the empty cavern of his skull. He is weak, heavily sedated, and terrified. He is no longer the massive, immovable Uncle Cleve who controlled the ledgers and dictated the terms of reality. He is a mutilated, dependent patient. Who becomes his shield? Who orchestrates the massive cover-up? Frances. While Cleveland is recovering in secret at their summer home in Buzzards Bay, Massachusetts, a reporter named E.J. Edwards uncovers the truth. Edwards publishes an incredibly detailed, accurate expose in the Philadelphia Press, detailing the secret surgery on the yacht, the removal of the jaw, the cancer. It is a journalistic masterpiece. Frances Cleveland personally leads the campaign to destroy Edwards. She does not merely deny the story. She orchestrates a systematic, ruthless character assassination of the journalist. She utilizes her immense popularity and her unassailable public credibility to brand Edwards a fabricator, a liar, and a calamity howler. She forces the administration to release statements claiming the president merely had a minor toothache. She completely controls the flow of information. She gaslights the entire nation. She is so effective, so universally trusted, that the American public entirely believes her. E.J. Edwards is blacklisted, his career ruined. The secret of the jaw surgery is successfully buried. not revealed to the public until 1917, nearly a decade after Cleveland's death. Look closely at this specific mechanism. Frances uses the very tactics of psychological manipulation and environmental control that Cleveland used on her when she was 11. She isolates the threat. She controls the narrative. She utilizes her power to protect her asset, but the asset is no longer her. The asset is him. To function as president, Cleveland is secretly fitted with a vulcanized rubber prosthesis, a plug designed to fill the massive hole in his skull so he can speak clearly. Every time he addresses the public, every time he vetoes a bill, he is relying on a piece of hidden rubber and the absolute ironclad protection of his wife. The final years of his presidency are miserable. The depression deepens. His party turns against him. He leaves office in 1897 as a pariah. They retire to Princeton, New Jersey. The physical deterioration of Grover Cleveland accelerates. He becomes increasingly deaf, heavily afflicted by gout, his massive frame shrinking, his rigid certainty dissolving into bitter old age. Contrast this with the physical reality of Frances. As he withers, she enters the prime of her life. She is in her 30s. She continues to have children, ensuring the lineage, expanding her own domain. She manages the household. She manages his schedule. She manages his legacy. The man who bought her the wicker carriage is now entirely dependent on her for his daily comfort, his public dignity, and his historical reputation. The cage he built for her is still there, but she now holds the only key, and she decides when and if he is allowed to look out the window. The issue is not whether Frances Folsom survived Grover Cleveland. She clearly did. She thrived. The issue, the dark, uncomfortable truth at the core of this historical narrative, is the psychological toll of that survival. She did not escape the system of manipulation. She merely mastered it. She learned that power is not about overt force. It is about controlling the narrative, managing the ledgers, and outlasting your opponent. She watched the man who systematically eradicated her choices slowly lose his own. She served him faithfully until his death in 1908. He died at the age of 71. His final words were reportedly, "I have tried so hard to do right." It is a pathetic, deeply revealing final statement from a man whose hamartia blinded him to the difference between doing right and demanding absolute control. Frances was 43 years old when she became a widow. She had spent exactly 32 years from the moment her father died, when she was 11, until the moment her husband died, living entirely within the psychological parameters established by Grover Cleveland. When he took his final breath, she inherited his estate, she inherited his historical narrative, and for the first time in her conscious life, she inherited herself. 5 years after Grover Cleveland's death, the ultimate proof of her suppressed autonomy finally surfaces. In 1913, at the age of 48, Frances Folsom Cleveland makes a choice that entirely belongs to her. She remarries. She does not marry a guardian. She does not marry a man 28 years, her senior, who controls her finances. She marries Thomas Jex Preston, Jr., a professor of archaeology at Princeton. He is a man of her own generation. He's an academic, not a political titan. For the remainder of her incredibly long life, she lived until 1947, reaching the age of 83. She exists as a fully actualized, independent woman. She leads the National Security Committee during World War I. She advocates for education. She proves, beyond a shadow of a doubt, that she possessed the intellectual and emotional capacity for immense public leadership entirely independent of Grover Cleveland's shadow. Her survival instinct makes her a compelling, resilient figure. It proves she possessed her own agency later in life. But it does absolutely nothing to absolve the architecture of her early existence. The historical debate often fixates on whether Grover Cleveland genuinely loved his wife. That misses the point entirely. The true horror lies in the mechanics of his acquisition. Looking at the raw sequence of events, from the wicker carriage in Buffalo to the Blue Room of the White House, the word grotesque surfaces organically. I call it grotesque because it represents the methodical, systemic eradication of human choice. Modern psychology outlines grooming as a predatory process where an adult builds a foundation of trust with a minor, isolates them, and lowers their inhibitions for future control. Cleveland executed this with the cold, unfeeling precision of a corporate merger. Rather than simply waiting for a young girl to mature, he aggressively monopolized the resources she needed to survive. He weaponized grief. He utilized the sudden vacuum left by Oscar Folsom's death to install himself as the sole financial provider, the ultimate authority, and the only viable future. He shipped her across an ocean to prevent her from entering the American marriage market, sending his proposal only when she was completely geographically and financially dependent on his goodwill. Good historical analysis does not end by simply labeling a man a devil. Grover Cleveland is the ultimate product of the Gilded Age. This was an era defined by ruthless consolidation and the creation of empires. Men of his generation believed that aggressive acquisition was a moral virtue. John D. Rockefeller cornered the market on oil. Andrew Carnegie monopolized steel. J.P. Morgan consolidated the banks. Cleveland applied that exact same industrial logic to a human life. He identified a valuable asset in its infancy, eliminated all competitors, controlled the supply lines, and waited patiently for the investment to mature. His fatal weakness, that obsessive, suffocating need for total dominance over his environment, manifested as a 21-year contract of indentured affection. His legacy is a moral debt incurred against a child's right to self-determination. He was an honest politician who engineered a deeply dishonest private reality. If it weren't for the tragic overturning of Oscar Folsom's carriage on that July afternoon in 1875, history might have recorded a very different life for Frances Folsom. She might have inherited a father's protection rather than a predator's patience. The history books record a White House fairy tale, painting a picture of a gruff bachelor president tamed by a beautiful young bride. The reality is far more clinical. Grover Cleveland achieved the absolute pinnacle of American power, yet his most terrifying accomplishment was not political. It was the quiet, relentless patience of a 27-year-old man buying a carriage for a newborn, knowing exactly what he intended to collect when the debt came due,